Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you are doing great. Now, America is at the verge of its decline. But what's really ironical is that America still thinks that it's one of the best. America still thinks that it can go around and order any other country. But there's one side of the thing that America don't see, that other people are seeing, especially people outside America are seeing. And one thing that stands is this: America is crumbling down, and it's looking a group of people that it can crumble with. You can definitely see this. Brothers and sisters, the video that you are about to watch is a video by Paul Warburg. Paul Warburg is a renowned geopolitician that talks about things, things that happen across the world, especially things involving politics, climate, and everything. In this video, he noted something that is happening with America. America's decline is worse than all of us think. Brothers and sisters, I want us to watch this video. I think it's really important that we get to understand everything that he's saying. And then I'm going to be back. I'll be sharing my 2 cents in regards to this. So let's watch the video. I'll be back.
There are two major events going on in the world right now that are completely reshaping the way that most people living outside of the US perceive American military power. Those two things are, of course, the war in Ukraine and the war in Iran, both of which, for similar, but also for some completely different reasons, are actually undermining the perception that most people had of US military dominance. And even early on in this video, as I make that comment, there will already be two kinds of viewers. There will be the first viewer who says, yes, I understand that intuitively. Literally everybody is talking about that. And there will be the other kind of viewer who will say, I have heard nothing about that, and I am completely insane for even suggesting such a thing. That alone tells you how bad this problem could really become. Because there's a major divergence right now between how the world outside of the United States views the US and how the US continues to view itself. The United States, for the average person living in the United States, their vision of US military power is largely unchanged. The US has been the military power, the preeminent military power, for their entire lifetime, and they see no evidence of that having shifted. But people living outside of the United States, they're starting to ask some serious questions. And they're noticing a lot of developments and a lot of people talking as if the United States is no longer in the room in the same way they were just a couple of years ago. And that goes for both the US allies, but also the United States' enemies. And that's a big deal. And when everybody outside of the room is talking about you in the exact same way, people who want you to succeed and people who want you to fail, that does tell you that there might be some truth to it. Now, even if this perception is completely untrue, it turns out that that is a very bad thing for the United States. Because as you'll realize as you watch today's video, a large amount of American military power, and really just American power in general, came from perceptions. There was a perception of two things. Number one, that the United States was the most powerful military with weapons that no other nation could match. And the other thing was that the United States was willing and able to use that power to support its allies and to protect its interests around the world. Those two assumptions about the United States, those two truisms, may no longer be so very true. And a lot of that comes down to global events that the average American, frankly, finds boring and just pays no attention to. Now, inevitably, whenever I create a video on a topic like this, I'm accused by many people of being unpatriotic, or by others of even actively betraying my country, simply for sharing facts and ideas that I myself also find to be uncomfortable. So as we get into the video, I should start by stating my intentions. And my intentions here are pretty clear. I think my country has made some very serious mistakes over the past several years. And they're mistakes that are actually very similar to the mistakes that brought down other major global empires. So far from criticizing my country for the sake of criticizing them, I'm going to be offering some critiques that the outside world is already offering. I'm not inventing anything for this video. Instead, I'm just making Americans more aware of the critiques that others are leveling against us and the way that we are actually perceived by the outside world, with the hope, with the goal that maybe we can change some of that for the better, if that would still be a good thing. Our country has done a lot of things that are really, really bad for us, and the only way for us to reverse course is for us to actually understand that and to actually engage with those ideas instead of just reflexively pumping our chest and saying we're the best ever, always, no matter what. Anybody who says otherwise is just a propagandist or a hater. That is exactly how empires fall. It is because of internal pride, unable to see the things that are actually happening to them until it's already too late. I would really hate to see that happen to my own country, because the United States, for a lot of its history, has truly been a force for good in this world. That said, even in the most serious of times, I firmly believe it's important to still be able to be a little bit lighthearted. One way to do that is by imagining yourself in a scenario where the world fundamentally changed around you. I've been having a lot of fun doing that lately with the sponsor who made the research for today's episode possible, which is Off Protocol's Illustrated Survival Guide to 4 Apocalypses. A really fun book. I wanted to show you guys this book because it is just so fun. It shares everything you need to know to survive as a main character following a global catastrophe, whether that be caused by global warming, a pandemic, nuclear winter, or even zombies. Each chapter of the book features hand-drawn cinematic illustrations that are inspired by post-apocalyptic classics, and it's something that you can have fun with whether you're a survival enthusiast or just a lover of dystopian adventure. And while that might sound a little comical and lighthearted, because it is, it also offers some genuinely good insights. For example, I spend a lot of time in the mountains, and the book offers some genuinely good tips for keeping warm and cozy in the worst of conditions. There's a guide to how to build your own snowshoes, how to build your own makeshift sunglasses, how to dig an emergency shelter in the snow, and a lot more. There's 400 plus pages of good stuff covering so many different scenarios. I personally keep a copy of this at my mountain cabin, but it's also great for any coffee table where you and the kids can learn something new every day by flipping through it. If you want to check it out for yourself, you can actually get a special discount by using my code PAUL4BOOK. Just use the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen and use that discount code PAUL4BOOK. Thanks again to Off Protocol for sponsoring today's video. So as we get into this discussion about whether or not the United States is losing its military dominance, we should be really precise about what people actually mean when they say things like that. And to be very clear, nobody is saying that the United States military has somehow become less powerful overnight. The United States military still has world-class weapon systems, most of which are unmatched by any competitors. And even if they're matched in certain weapon systems, the United States military, more than any military on the planet, has the full package. We have the world's most powerful Navy, the world's most powerful Air Force, and all sorts of ground systems and other globally distributed technology that help to support those roles. If the United States military wanted to put the full force of the United States into a war, they would probably win against pretty much any opponent on the planet. And for most people, that's still basically without question. But that is talking about US military power. And what we're talking about in today's video is US military dominance, which is not exactly the same thing. Because it turns out that military dominance isn't just about how many weapon systems you have, how good those weapon systems are, or how well trained your military is on those weapon systems. Military dominance actually historically is a measure of willpower. And in many cases, technologically inferior forces become dominant over technologically superior forces because they have more willpower. If you think of war as a measure of willpower, having the best technology means you need less willpower to win that war. Fighting the war is easier for you. If you can bomb a target from 4,000 miles away and be very effective with basically no risk to yourself, it's going to take a lot less willpower for you to stay engaged in that war. But that doesn't mean you actually have more willpower than your opponents. And what has primarily happened on the global stage over the past several years is that there has been a change in everybody's calculus about the United States' actual willpower when it comes to engaging in warfare. And on top of this, we do have a technological change with the war in Ukraine, which is changing the nature of warfare in many ways away from the primary advantages that the United States still has. The United States' advantages aren't going away, but they are a little bit less relevant today than they were just a couple of years ago, and we'll get into that. But first, we should talk about how this lack of willpower has been demonstrated, or at least perceived, by the majority of the world right now. So we'll look in two major places for the data for today's video, which are the war in Iran and the war in Ukraine. But we'll also loop in some recent historical wars like the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq and even the war in Vietnam. Because what you'll see is that the trends that kind of began during those time periods have now carried forward to today in a major way, and it's a major part of the perception. Let's start, though, with the war in Iran and how this is changing the perception of how everybody views the United States, where people are now realizing that the United States actually does not have the willpower to achieve its geopolitical objectives the way that it once did. Now, when I say that, a lot of people are going to at first say, what are you talking about? The war in Iran is a war that the United States essentially fired the first shots on. You might say they had very good reason to fire those shots. That's not the point of this video. The point is the United States fired the first shots because Iran was doing things that the United States did not like. Is not that the very definition of willpower? And to an extent, it is, but there's a major problem with the war in Iran, where the United States has revealed its hand to every country on Earth how utterly unwilling it actually is to take military casualties to achieve its own stated military objectives. And that is a huge, huge deal, and it has changed the calculus of power in ways that most people have not recognized yet, but you can be certain that it has. What's happened in Iran is that the United States has demonstrated the stunning power of the United States military. But at the same time, they have also demonstrated that the United States military may no longer be dominant. What happened in Iran is the United States started this war, a war they thought they could win easily, just with aerial power, taking limited, if any, casualties at all. And at first, that power was stunning. They bombed so many objectives overnight, they continued the pressure, and Iran's military was severely weakened in just the opening act. So far, so good. The US looks pretty dominant. But then something strange happened. The war just started to drag on. Iran declared that the Strait of Hormuz was closed, and the US military, the most powerful navy on the planet, did not actually intervene to open the Strait of Hormuz. And you have to ask yourself why they didn't do that. They're the most dominant military on the planet. Certainly, they could probably have achieved it. And the answer to that question is they probably could achieve it. But it's not an objective that they could achieve without taking casualties. And casualties probably in the form of a U.S. naval vessel being sunk or several U.S. naval vessels being sunk, creating headlines that say that there were casualties in the hundreds, if not in worst case scenarios, in the thousands for U.S. soldiers. A tragedy, to be sure, but something that actually, historically speaking, is pretty normal when it came to warfare. And as all of this has dragged out, people have realized that the US military is perfectly willing to exert power when it thinks there's no cost to that power. But the US military is not actually willing at this point, politically, to do the number one most important thing that you have to do if you want to ensure success in warfare, which is commit to an objective even if it costs the lives of your soldiers. I'm not talking here as if losing soldiers is good. I'm talking here simply from the standpoint of military dominance over history. I personally prefer to lose the lives of less soldiers. But what's happened in Iran is people are starting to realize, even though the US military could be completely dominant over Iran if they chose to invest the full weight of their military into that objective, it's pretty clear that the US military isn't actually willing to do that. And if the US military were to get involved in a conflict in Iran, Though if both of those nations went head to head, ultimately the United States mathematically would probably be dominant. The reality is that the people of Iran have sufficient willpower to overcome the willpower of the United States. And that's why, to this day, we see Iran still engaged in this fight and the US military not exerting the dominance that it could to bring that conflict to a conclusion. Now, if Iran was the only case study in this, we might say, we're just guessing here, but Iran is not the only case study. In fact, Iran is just a demonstration of what has happened to the US military really since the Vietnam era, which is that for the US military, especially in the media age, warfare has become more and more political and less about actual military capabilities. The problem with the United States, if we want to call it that, at least from a military perspective, is that we're a democracy, which has a lot of strengths for internal cohesion, but it does have some particular weaknesses when it comes to military action, which is that our leaders are elected on cycles of every 2 years or every 4 years, depending on their position. And that means that our leaders are very sensitive to public opinion. And public opinion is very sensitive to seeing our soldiers actually fall in battle, especially because we have this picture of the United States as so militarily dominant that actually our soldiers shouldn't ever have to perish in warfare. That's how powerful we really are. In the Vietnam age, this played out where the strongest weapon that the Vietnamese had against the United States was the cameras of American journalists, who actually documented the horrors of warfare so that the average American citizen could see what was going on over there. The average American citizen could then ask questions about why we were involved in that war in the first place and whether it was worth the cost. And you have this dragging conversation on the backs of the politicians, always this nagging voice telling them, hey, we don't actually think that you should continue to fight this war, or at least there's at least some people in the audience who have that voice. This means that the United States cannot engage in warfare the same way that, for example, in World War I or World War II, these countries engaged in warfare, where there were massive casualty events, warfare of the past, where it truly was about what country was willing to invest enough resources to actually see things through to the conclusion. Now the United States has all the resources, but the public of the United States is more unwilling than ever before to actually invest those resources. And good examples aren't just Vietnam. We can look more recently at Iraq and Afghanistan, which were wars where, from a military perspective, at least at first, just like the war in Iran, the United States was just breathtakingly powerful. You look at how quickly we achieved at least our initial military objectives in Afghanistan and in Iraq and, the siege of Baghdad, and how effective we were in those areas. And it's just, it's just breathtaking. But the problem was that Americans began to question the objectives once the war started to drag on. And in these wars, with relatively low casualties, of course, every casualty matters, but relatively low casualties when it comes to warfare, and especially when compared to our enemies, we began to be exhausted by casualties that measured in the single-digit thousands, while our opponents continued to be willing to fight against us, even when their casualties measured in the tens of thousands at the very least. So we saw that the United States could exert a massive cost on our opponents. Our military could do what it was designed to do, but the political willpower behind that military didn't exist to actually see the objective through to conclusion. And by the way, these were things that our opponents in these cases knew. This was the major thesis in Vietnam of our opponents, was that, look, we're not as powerful as the US soldier, but if we can demoralize the American public, our willpower will last longer than the willpower of the American public, and eventually the Americans will back out and we will be victorious, and that is exactly what happened. This is the attitude of the guerrilla fighters in Afghanistan, and eventually this is sort of what happens. We didn't know what the objective was or how to actually achieve it, and so eventually administrations change. You have several different presidents, and eventually we're just kind of tired of the whole thing and we leave. This is exactly what Iran has observed, and this is exactly what Iran is counting on with the Trump administration. The Trump administration has already revealed that they are politically sensitive to any casualties in the war in Iran, and therefore there are real limits to how much warfare the US will actually engage in against Iran. And so Iran knows it does not have to defeat the US military on the battlefield. It just has to cause a sufficient amount of damage, which in this case is rather small, to ensure that the US public no longer supports that action. Now, this unwillingness to bear casualties is a big weakness for the United States, at least again from a military dominance perspective. And I can assure you, countries like China are watching, countries that do not have the same constraints as us, countries where their leaders are not democratically elected, where they serve for life and they really don't care about the opinion of their people. They know that they will probably be willing to invest more resources in any given objective than the United States, even if on paper, the United States dwarfs their resources, and that's a big deal. But it turns out to be more of a problem than even this, because these are not the only theaters, this is not the only way that the US has shown itself as unwilling to engage in warfare. Because not only in cases like Iran, where the United States is actually at war, has the US demonstrated an unwillingness to invest what it needs to achieve those objectives that it itself has chosen. Recently in the world, the US has of course shown an unwillingness to protect its geopolitical objectives, things that were considered sacred to the United States throughout the Cold War and really, into the early 2000s. And what I'm talking about here is the war in Ukraine, where when Ukraine was invaded, the United States did something that shocked a lot of people, which is, yes, we did provide some support to Ukraine, but that support really was not very decisive. And actually, as Russia participated in this full-scale invasion of Ukraine, one of the first instincts of about half of the United States was to criticize Ukraine for being invaded. In this case, largely, not completely, but largely due to propaganda that was seeded by Russia into the US. We had this conversation about how much money the war in Ukraine was costing us. And if you do the analysis, it really wasn't much money at the end of the day, because not only were these quantities of resources and funds just minuscule compared to the overall US military budget compared to what they were actually buying, but those resources were going to have to be invested anyways because most of our equipment was going bad. Bombs go bad, and instead of, having to pay to deactivate those bombs, decommission those bombs, we actually got to send a lot of this equipment to Ukraine and actually achieve an objective. That put aside, there was a perception in the United States that this war was costing us a lot of money, not just our own human lives, but money. And that was a bridge too far for much of the American public. Now, again, this is not me trying to tell you what you should think. This is me telling you how other nations perceive when the US makes decisions like that. And what other nations perceive is that the United States is no longer a military power who's actually willing to invest anything to protect its historical objectives, which historically the United States supported democracy around the world, not just because we thought that was the best thing for the world, though of course we did, but because we saw that as, number one, it was a buffer between us and nations that would do war with us. If there's other democracies that we can support, that's better than us directly having to go to war, but also because this gives us more trading partners. It builds up the monetary system that we're at the top of, where the United States dollar is the US reserve currency. And on the back of that, the US actually makes a lot of money. There's a reason that the United States is able to run up so much debt, and it hasn't really become a massive issue. This is a whole nother topic. My point is, the US has historically understood things like Ukraine as being in their best interest. And that's why in the 90s, we actually entered into security agreements with Ukraine where we promised them that if they were invaded, that we would come to their aid. Legally binding or not, those were the types of agreements we were making. And in principle and spirit, that was the kind of country that we were. As Russia invaded Ukraine, we showed we're no longer willing to sacrifice our money, our prosperity, for the sake of our long-term prosperity. I would actually put it that way. We're not willing to sacrifice our immediate prosperity for the sake of our long-term prosperity, maybe because we're unwilling, but also because we've become so used to actually consuming that prosperity that we actually don't even make the connection anymore, because we're so used to living with the benefits of our geopolitical system that we don't even have to put in the effort to understanding what that geopolitical system is anymore. Ask the average American what being a reserve currency actually means or how that benefits them. And I promise you, probably a number far greater than 99% will look at you with blank stares. Now, this didn't just start, by the way, when Russia fully invaded Ukraine back in the 2020s. This actually started when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea back in 2014, where the United States basically just slapped Russia on the wrist. We just gave them economic sanctions, which, might have seemed meaningful on the surface, but it was pretty easy for Russia to skirt. We basically said, we're going to do something about this without actually doing something about it. And that was what was played on top of for Russia to seed the propaganda into the United States to prepare the US to achieve their objectives when Russia invaded Ukraine. And Russia's objective for the United States in that war wasn't to defeat the US military on the battlefield, but to do something even better, which was to prevent, to the extent possible, the US military from being on the battlefield in the first place. The same thing, to a large degree, that is now happening in Iran, because the US military is so terrified of casualties. Now, what's really disturbing about all of this is that the average American, as I've already kind of said, is blissfully unaware of this trend. In fact, they think it's the complete opposite. They think they're still dominant, unaware of their country's own unwillingness to actually use that dominance. But I promise you, our enemies are not unaware of this. In fact, it is explicitly guiding their military strategies. When we look at Russia, like I already said, one of the reasons they invaded Ukraine with their full-scale invasion is because they correctly predicted that the United States and Europe, for that matter, would be unwilling to take the risk of actually militarily intervening to protect Ukraine. And that's brought us where we are today. But it's not just Russia, it's also China. Right now, one of the main things driving Chinese military strategy is not the idea that they can fully defeat the United States military on the battlefield in a full-scale war of attrition, but actually the strategy that's called anti-access aerial denial, A2D2 kind of strategy. The idea is that if we can simply prevent the United States from easily entering certain areas, and if we can just sink a couple of US aircraft carriers, not their entire military, if we can just take out a couple of major objectives, the US public will be so demoralized that they'll actually leave that war. And they may actually be right. If they could just sink a carrier or two, maybe we'll be unwilling to protect a target like Taiwan, if the American public perceive that as a war of choice and not a war of necessity. And this is also something that both Russia and China and probably other countries play into as well. They have literal propaganda armies. I am talking about skyscrapers, office buildings full of people whose job it is to sit on American social media platforms and pretend to be Americans and guide the narrative. Russia did this, as I said, with Ukraine to prevent the US from wanting to support Ukraine by spreading what was pretty blatantly obvious propaganda, but Americans didn't know anything about Ukraine, and so Russia drove the narrative. China attempts to do the same thing, and they're probably successful to degrees that we don't even know. To control American thinking, to control American politics, the information space, to create, or at least to assist the mood in the United States that makes us unwilling to bear these kinds of losses. And so they are preceding the ground ahead of time in American politics to make us more sensitive to the casualties of our warriors. It's a really, really devious game. And it's not one that the United States is playing to nearly the same degree, which means we have structural vulnerabilities that our opponents simply do not have. Now, if that's not disturbing enough, and if that doesn't cause Americans and American politicians in particular to wake up, there's some even worse things that are happening to US military dominance right now. And that actually has to do with the way that the nature of warfare is changing, or in fact has changed over the past several years due to the war in Ukraine. And I have several examples to cite here. The overall trend, of course, is moving away from expensive, top-of-the-line military equipment to cheap, disposable things like drones that can get the job done at a much lower cost. We've already seen in the war in Ukraine how tanks have been rendered not totally obsolete, but mostly obsolete except for in very niche circumstances, because a multi-million-dollar tank can be taken out by a drone that costs under $1,000. That trend is all over the place. And Ukraine is the one driving innovation in drones. We've actually seen examples where Ukrainian drone units facing NATO battalions in war games, entire battalions have been taken out by tiny Ukrainian drone units because the West, including the United States, doesn't have the same expertise that Ukraine has in this area. The United States still might have overall more military expertise than Ukraine when it comes to naval power and air power. But we don't have the same expertise in the way that warfare is actually being fought today. Not just how it theoretically could be fought, but how it's actually being fought. And in Iran, we've seen examples of this, where Ukraine has the technology to take out the drones that Iran is using to threaten the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States doesn't. And so when the Iran war started, the Gulf states didn't just turn to the United States for protection, they actually turned to Ukraine, because they recognize the US has these big, expensive systems, but Ukraine has cheap systems that are good enough and they get the job done. We've seen several examples of this in the war on Ukraine. Ukraine has been using F-16s. Now, these are not the top-of-the-line U.S. fighter jets. They're not the best we have to offer, but they're pretty darn good. And these F-16s have proven to be pretty limited for several different reasons. They can do certain missions, but there's a lot of missions they can't do. And so Ukraine is now choosing to incorporate the Swedish Gripen aircraft into their air force to plug holes that the U.S. aircraft are incapable of filling. And these Gripens are far cheaper than the U.S. aircraft per unit because they're not designed to maximize profits for defense firms. They're designed to actually get the job done and to defeat a superior foe at a cost that is actually achievable for countries that do not have the budget of the United States. This is a big deal. There's one tool left that the United States has that's actually in play in Ukraine, and only one that still only uniquely the United States has this capability. And even that gap is being quickly closed. And this is, of course, the Patriot missile that is used to intercept ballistic missiles that Russia fires into Ukraine on a regular basis. Right now, Ukraine is still dependent on U.S. Patriot missiles, just one category of weapon system. All the others they either get from their partners or they produce on their own. And now they're even producing a Patriot missile alternative that has already been successfully tested. So it's not just theory, it works. And the unit cost is not coming in at around $4 million, where the U.S. Patriots come, or I think like $5.5 or $6 million, what we sell them to other countries for. The unit cost is coming in at roughly $1 million US, so a much lower price, which is very important if you're shooting down waves and waves of enemy ballistic missiles. The point is that while I have said, and it remains true, that the US still remains militarily dominant, that gap is being closed in a way that has never happened before. We have new technologies, the nature of warfare has changed, and we're actually being left behind as the nature of warfare itself changes. That creates a vulnerability for us, not immediately, but potentially in 2 or 3 decades, certainly in 50 years, if we don't adjust and recognize what's going on. Where not only will we be seen as not militarily dominant because of our unwillingness to invest the best resources, which are objectively the best, but we will have the unwillingness in a scenario where maybe we won't actually even have the best anymore. That could really happen. Now, to Americans, all of this may sound shocking and surprising and demoralizing, but to those living outside of our borders, it's not shocking or surprising. Maybe it is still demoralizing, but it's just not a surprise to anybody except for us. The United States right now, we exist in a unique position in the world. We are the dominant power on the globe, and those who occupy that position historically always assume that it will always remain that way. And historically, of course, it has never remained that way. Because those who sit at the top, they have a reason, an incentive to close their eyes so they can continue living at the top. While everybody else around them, everybody's always striving for that top position. And this takes empires down one after the other over history. People who fail to adapt, they get left behind. And we can see this in the geopolitical space, but if that's too hard, to grasp conceptually, you can also see it in the corporate space. Look at a lot of the top companies in the world right now. How many of those companies existed 50 years ago? 50 years ago, there was a different set of top companies in the world that everybody thought would be around forever. And then a new era of innovation happened, and they wanted to remain in the old era rather than adjusting to the new era, and they got left behind, and eventually they went out of business. It happens all the time, and we could look at that generation after generation after generation. The same thing certainly happens from a geopolitical standpoint, even if it's a little bit more complicated, even if it typically takes more time. So with all of this context now said, we should define the risk to the United States here. And the risk to the United States is not an attack on the US mainland. I don't see that happening anytime soon. The US mainland is so safe for so many different reasons. We have all of these oceans, between us and our major opponents. The US mainland is also a self-sustaining mainland, meaning we have essentially every resource that we actually need to continue fighting and sustaining ourselves. And US willpower is something that can be activated, and historically, it is activated when the mainland is threatened. For example, we look at World War I, World War II, wars that when they started were perceived as Europe's wars or Asia's wars by Americans. In both of those wars, we ultimately got involved, and when we got involved with vigor because we saw that we were being threatened. In the case of World War I, it was the Zimmerman Note Germany asking Mexico to join the war and attack the United States, and Germany saying that they would help Mexico achieve that, and so we felt threatened, and so we joined the war against Germany in that case. And in World War II, it was, of course, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. These events where we as Americans actually feel threatened, they invigorate us, and an invigorated United States is a force to be reckoned with. Everybody knows that now. It's beyond question. As Japan said when they bombed Pearl Harbor, but they failed to achieve their major objective, which was taking out the Pacific Fleet before the United States could engage in war against us, they said, by doing that, they have awoken a sleeping giant, and certainly they had. That is the threat of any country that would attack the United States, and that's not going away. Drone warfare doesn't change the fact that the United States has a dominant nuclear force or things like that that could destroy people who threatened us personally, but the threat to the United States is our geopolitical power. And the problem the United States faces is that the average American does not understand how important that actually is to them. The average American does not know that their country is a global empire, and it's not the type of empire that we had in the past where we actually possess territory and extract resources, but we effectively get those same outcomes because of the way our military is established across the globe. There's a reason that our Navy operates in ports all over the world, and so does our Air Force. And it's not just for the best interests of everybody else, it's for our own interests. We get a lot of wealth when people feel safe trading with us, and we have this reserve currency system. We establish things like this on purpose. It was the Bretton Woods system that we built up after the end of World War II. And as we show that we're ignorant of how that actually works, I would say directly so with a lot of the policies that we keep voting for, we're also showing ourselves to be militarily unwilling to defend those interests. And so as we lose those interests, the real threat to the United States isn't a military threat. It's an economic one at the end of the day, in my opinion. The threat is that we lose access to the system that has supported the biggest wealth-gaining capabilities really in history, especially for a population our size. And while that might sound, minor compared to military stuff, historically it's not. When you have a declining power where people were wealthy and all of a sudden they lose that, the effects on the nation are drastic. It causes massive political changes, a lot of political unrest, and then that can create the conditions in the future for a power that was once militarily dominant to be fractured, and that is when the vultures come in and they pick up the pieces. This is the direction the United States could go. I'm not saying it's the direction it will go, but it's the direction that we could go over the next 100 years if we do not pay attention. And as I've said, it is something that has happened to every empire before us. What happened to Rome, America? Why does Europe no longer bend the knee to Caesar? Now, this is a big topic, and it's going to generate a lot of discussion and a lot of questions. And so if you enjoyed this video, I want to invite you to also join the Insider member Q&As that I put on for my YouTube channel Insiders and my patrons. I will be answering a lot of follow-up questions that the audience is asking about this video and really every video that I post in those special videos. that I do, again, as a thank you for the insiders and the patrons who support the job I do here on YouTube and make these videos possible. So if you want to become part of that, just look in the description for links or click the join button next to my face right below this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'm looking forward to the discussion in the comments. I'll see you on the next video.